where is the war right now? Well, Russia has got the strategic initiative. Russia has been pressing hard. We haven't seen the sort of full-scale spring, early summer offensive that many expected and that was forecast. But nevertheless, Russia continues to grind down Ukraine in its eastern territories at vast expense. I mean, incomprehensible expense to us in the West, to Russia, but it doesn't care. Russia continues to conduct and commit the most appalling war crimes. Witness the deliberate attack on a children's hospital with children going through chemotherapy with drips attached to them, being evacuated, covered in blood and dust from that attack. I mean, that was deliberate state policy. And it was deliberate state policy by the current chair of the UN Security Council, an organization under the terms of the UN Charter of Human Rights committed to removing aggression. Well, how cynical and revolting is that? So, there's a long way to go here. And Ukraine has not only got to defend itself, it's got to build up its armed forces, particularly its army, and it's got to build up its air force. The delivery of F-16s is only, it was heralded with great triumph at the NATO summit. But have you seen a photograph of an F-16 landing in Ukraine yet? Question mark. Maybe they're not being released because of security reasons, but I haven't seen any pictures of that. So there's a heck of a long way to go here. And then, Ukraine needs the time to train the reserves it is mobilizing under the new terms of mobilization. It needs to build up its offensive capability in terms not just of individual training of soldiers, but of the collective training of battalions, of brigades, of divisions, and of corps. And it's got to bring online the host of additional military support from the West. So this is going to be a long run. We in the West and in NATO and the Euro-Atlantic region need to recognize that Russia is never going to give up its determination to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign nation and to destroy NATO, to get rid of NATO or to neutralize NATO. Russia has set itself on that path. Russia is at war not only with Ukraine, but it's at war with the West. It thinks of itself as at war with NATO. And the only way that we are going to enjoy peace in the Euro-Atlantic region for generations to come is through a NATO band of deterrent steel to include Ukraine having defeated Russia.
Well, let's explore that. I mean, if you were going to draw up a plan, a strategy for the total defeat of Russia, and how you define that, I suppose, is an interesting question. But let's say it's returning Russia to its pre-2014 borders and returning the land that's been occupied ever since. Whether you think that's realistic or not is I suppose, a massive question. But what would be required to ensure that Ukraine could achieve that total victory?
Well, let's be clear. By total defeat of Russia, you're implying the sort of thing that was done to Germany in 1945. I'm not talking about that. That is never going to happen. I'm talking about defeat of Russian forces in Ukraine. Yes, I am talking about the return of Ukraine lands occupied since 2014. I am talking about Russia making, for example, the Crimea impossible for Russia to hold on to. I don't necessarily think you need to do that with what would be a massively complex, difficult, and horrendously expensive in terms of blood and treasure amphibious invasion of Crimea. But I do think you can make Crimea impossible for the Russians to hold on to. And to me, that is the center of gravity. And if Ukraine can hold on in its eastern provinces, continue to push back the Russians, or firstly to hold, but to push them back, but to focus on what I think is Russia's center of gravity here, which is Ukraine, and not just military, but political center of gravity, and make it impossible for Russia to hold on to through the application of long-range precision missiles and the like, then I think things could change very, very quickly. And there's another point I would make here. It's not just about giving Ukraine the means to defeat Russia. And by means, I mean long-range precision missiles, which have been, pretty, yes, HIMARS, yes, Storm Shadow, but where are the German Tauruses? There's a lot more to do. But it's also about not tying Ukraine's hands behind its back and allowing Ukraine to strike legitimate military targets in Russia with Western-supplied long-range precision missiles. We're still not there yet. At the same time, I recognize that NATO and where NATO goes is about the art of the possible, because you have to remember that getting the consensus of 32 different nations is a challenge. Where does NATO need to go? What should have come out? First, I think a clear statement should have come out that NATO is committed to supporting Ukraine in the defeat of Russia. No ifs, no buts. This is not a war that is going to end in negotiation. This is not something like the Northern Ireland peace process. This is closer to World War I or World War II. They did not end with negotiation. Putin will never accept negotiation. And if he does, it'll only be negotiation on the basis that he gets exactly what he wants. So NATO should have come up. I think this was the real opportunity in its 75th anniversary summit with a clear statement that NATO will develop and put together a strategy to support Ukraine in the defeat of Russia. But that was clearly a bridge too far this time. So what did we get? We got a statement, some good words about about NATO continuing to support Ukraine in its irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership, which is a great statement. But implicit in that is defeat of Russia. And NATO has shied away from that.
And again, that strikes me as highly surprising that, for example, it is largely the Americans who are imposing restrictions on where Ukraine can use US-supplied long-range missiles. And okay, I understand why certain NATO member states, such as Hungary, may have reluctance for their own domestic political reasons. But Joe Biden has been a very staunch supporter of Ukraine. It would be in Joe Biden's political interests and in America's strategic interests, you would have thought, to help Ukraine defeat Russia in the way you describe. And even though they've lifted some of the restrictions, are you still surprised that they're not going further? And why do you think that is?
Well, I'm not going to second guess the political judgments made in the Oval Office, but I as an observer, I would suggest that there has been an excess of caution from the United States. Yes, of course, it's given a huge amount of weaponry and capability, much of which is, in a sense, it's being made in America. So it's good news for American industry and defense industries. But I think there's been there's been a sort of degree of self-deterrence as a result of Putin's nuclear saber rattling. And I think we should remember the maxim, Churchill's great line about Russia only respects strength. Where it finds weakness, it will continue to probe. And so it has proven in the last 2 years. That Russia has, and Putin and his henchmen have waxed lyrical about the threat of nuclear weapons if tanks are deployed, if long-range weapons and missiles are deployed. When it's been deployed, it's not come to anything. And of course, don't forget that President Xi has already breathed down Putin's neck, saying, nuclear weapons are out.
And I also thought it was fascinating at the NATO summit how, for the first time, you had NATO leaders pretty equivocally denouncing China's role in the war. Of course, Beijing would say it's officially neutral, but most analysts would say that's not really credible. What do you make of the upping of rhetoric against President Xi and his role?
Well, it's certainly recognizing that it is in China's interests that this war should continue, that China is supplying dual-use technologies directly to Russia. It's almost certainly providing material and equipment to North Korea, which is then being shipped on to Ukraine. and that China, is as Xi and Putin have said, this bond of unbreakable friendship between them. And I think it's putting a marker down to China that it's not going to have it all its own way. But at the same time, there's got to be recognition in the West that there's a clear linkage between what happens in Ukraine and what happens in the Asia Pacific. If Putin is seen to get away with it in Ukraine, that will almost certainly embolden Xi. And the so what out of all this, of course, is the importance for effective deterrence and a need to think globally, because Putin absolutely thinks globally. He's wound up South Korea with his action in North Korea. So they're now in the equation. And we need to think globally as well.
And just finally, Jamal, I wanted to ask you about some of the challenges facing Russia. Obviously, we talk a lot about the supply issues for Ukraine, but according to the Institute for the Study of War, the Russian military command may have committed under-equipped units initially intended to act as an operational reserve to combat operations, possibly due to constraints on the Russian defense industrial base. As I say, supply issues for Ukraine have been much discussed, but do you think there's a real issue for Russia as well at the moment?
I saw that, and I read ISW sit-reps on pretty much a daily basis, and I think what happened. I think they're very, very well informed, and I think it's for any organization trying to understand what's happening in this particular in this vital conflict for European and transatlantic interests. I really would highlight the importance of ISW's work. I think that is a highly likely deduction to draw. We were promised a major spring-summer offensive. Thus far, it hasn't materialized, and that one of the reasons might be just because of the reasons you've just cited. However, don't take it for granted. Who knows what Russia might be beginning to be building up and keeping behind its sleeve. But thus far, it hasn't happened.
When Russian offensive towards Kharkiv collapsed, currently there's some serious battle in the area of Vovchansk. We know that Russians use a lot of their aviation, striking the area with gliding bombs. But other than that, they lost quite a lot of their personnel and their vehicles there. Of course, they can hire more personnel. They recruit approximately 30,000 men on a monthly basis. But again, we are talking about modern warfare, and modern warfare is impossible without machines. And this is something that Russians are struggling with at this point.
What about the weather? I mean, it's very hot at the moment in Ukraine, isn't it? How is that affecting the battlefield?
It's really, really hot, and especially on the front line, it's very hard. People don't fight wearing t-shirts in the real life. You should always wear uniform with long sleeves, in order not to expose yourselves, and this makes it very, very hard. So our guys, they, in my eyes, they were always heroes, but this weather makes them even bigger heroes than before.
Members of the Ukrainian army have told of witnessing cases of captured, injured Russian soldiers along the front line being sent back to the front line with having suffered already debilitating injuries. Some horrific details have been reported. Have you heard those kind of stories at all?
Not only I've heard those stories, but also there's plenty of footage from the front lines showing Russians self-annihilating. Basically, we're talking about wounded Russians that commit suicide because they understand that they will not be evacuated. They are left behind, and we can see more and more such videos every single day. Basically, monitoring channels in Telegram are full of those. They're very easy to find everywhere. Russian medical support, let's say, is in very, very bad shape. And of course, Russian traditional agenda of using their soldiers as cannon fodder. Again, it's very, very obvious and very well known for, I would say, centuries maybe.
Ukraine, according to the Institute for the Study of War, has continued targeting Russian air defense systems in occupied Ukraine and in Russia's border areas to prepare for the conditions to field F-16 fighter jets for their arrival late summer, maybe autumn. How long do you think it might take Ukraine to cause enough damage to those defences so they can safeguard the F-16s for combat operations?
It only depends, and I would say it directly depends on how many long-range drones, how many long-range weapons we can produce here in Ukraine, and how many of those we are being delivered by our allies, because those are the things that help us to destroy Russian air defense. But currently, we can see that Russian air defense is suffering big losses. For example, I believe it was in Belgorod or Rostov, there was obituary on a bunch of Russian soldiers published in the Russian media, where they admitted that together with those guys, they already lost 2 battalion commanders in the same unit. So their losses are huge, and we can also see this from the fact that their oil refineries keep burning, keep being destroyed. So it depends on the territory, it depends on the specific area, and of course it depends on the weaponry that we have.
And in the wider political sphere, Ukraine and Europe are now seriously considering Trump 2.0. Arguably, his presidency has been sealed by this assassination attempt on him. And J.D. Vance, potentially the next American vice president. How nervous is Ukraine about this, given that he is a skeptic who's spoken out against continuous funding for Ukraine and for direct US negotiations with Moscow to end the war?
There are different opinions regarding this, of course, specifically in Ukraine. But in my personal opinion, we should keep hoping for best. And regarding Mr. Trump and regarding J.D. Vance, from what I saw, they often change their opinions if some of their brilliant ideas stop working. One good example is Nikki Haley, for example. She was a big Ukrainian supporter, promoting Trump's presidency, of course, and in her many different speeches, she often supported Ukraine. She basically always supported Ukraine. She talked about the U.S. and Ukraine mostly, right? And since the beginning of this year, she stopped doing that when apparently she realized that she loses some of her audience by talking about Ukraine. And we are talking about the audience that is more susceptible to Russian propaganda and more susceptible to different conspiracies and things like that. So same with Donald Trump. I believe that as soon as he becomes president, he will realize that his idea of finishing the war in 24 hours is basically nonsense, because he cannot blackmail Ukrainians and he cannot blackmail Russians either. This is real life. So we will see. Same basically with with J.D. Vance, who despised Trump publicly in the beginning, but quickly changed his mind when he realized that the tides changed again. So we're talking about politics, and things change in politics every single day.
In Russia itself, there are some interesting articles that have been published after an interview that was given by Russia's Security Council Deputy Chairperson, where in response to the outgoing NATO Secretary General's comments that NATO will become a member in the next 10 years, Dmitry Medvedev said it never will, because in 10 years NATO leadership will have changed and the country will likely not exist. How are those comments being used in Russia, in the Russian Federation itself, to try and influence public opinion and shape it?
Recently, they started publishing a lot about this summit and about NATO in general, and I think is part of their agenda, because we see that Medvedev and different Russian news agencies like ITAR-TASS, they work together spreading those narratives. So I believe on ITAR-TASS last week they published an article where they completely perverted what Mr. Stoltenberg said about Ukraine's membership, basically saying that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO, which raises a question: why then did the war start? Because again, one of the biggest narratives that is shared by the Russian propaganda is that the war started because of NATO expansion. Ukraine could not become a member of NATO neither in 2010 nor in 2014, 15, 2020, for a simple reason. There's a statute of NATO, and in this statute it's said clearly that a country that has an ongoing war or ongoing conflict cannot become a member of NATO. And everybody who at least a bit interested in NATO and politics and history know about it. So Ukraine could not become a NATO member, and frankly speaking, even though we have and we always had a very, very close partnership, collaboration with NATO, with our Western allies, but we were never promised membership. We were never invited directly to become members. I don't remember a single case when that would happen, which on one hand, it's of course is very bad for us. On the other hand, even if Ukraine is granted membership like tomorrow, it doesn't change anything, because officially, again, Ukraine will not become NATO member until there are Russian invaders on our territory. And at the same time, this is something that completely destroys Russian narratives about invading Ukraine to protect from, against being invaded by evil Ukrainians, NATO members.
And doesn't it also obliterate any concept that Russia would consider some kind of peace anytime soon?
Unfortunately, yes, and we know that Russia will only stop this war when they have no capability to continue attacking, when they realize that they will not reach their military targets. And in best case, of course, when Russian invaders are removed from the Ukrainian territory and the borders are restored. So recently, there were numerous reports about Russians building new launch stations, unified launch platforms for missiles like Onyx, like Caliber, and those platforms basically can be installed anywhere, like on the ground, on the ships, which tells that Russia is not planning peaceful resolution. And the only reason this happens is because they realize that they have chance. So I think one of the ways to make them less active, in their war efforts is to show clear support for Ukraine. Now, one of the things that was very, very important during the NATO summit was that Russia was designated as a primary threat for the NATO countries for the first times, because previously the strategy was a bit different. Previously, it was based on a belief that Russia may become democratic. Now the world realized that it's impossible, and Russia was clearly designated as main threat for NATO. And on the next summit that will take place in The Hague, there will be developed a new strategy regarding what to do with them. So I think from this standpoint, it's very helpful for Ukraine as well.
I remember serving in Germany during the height of the Cold War. My first tour in Germany, I was with the U.S. Army on the inter-German border with 2nd Brigade, 3rd Infantry Division. And I remember the Bundeswehr of the Cold War. I remember the Luftwaffe of the Cold War. And I hope and I pray all the time that Deutschland will step up to its leadership role, both financially and in policy towards Mr. Putin and Ukraine. If you had, there are amazing nations in NATO, but if the Polands, the UKs, the France, the Germanys of NATO set their mind to preparing for this, it would be demonstrative what NATO could do.
I thought one of the other really interesting things to come out of the NATO summit was the leaders using their strongest language yet to condemn China's role in regards to the war in Ukraine. Officially, Beijing would say it's neutral, but no one really believes that, and they've called them a decisive enabler of Putin's war, demanding China cease the shipment of weapons, components, and other parts to Russia. How significant is that, General?
Well, may I add one more twist to that? If you're following the same reporting I am, there are Chinese exercising in Belarus. So this is well beyond the conversation level of China's involvement in this business. If China is running around on the Polish border in Belarus or places like that, exercising, we are at a new phase of how this works. Listen, China's going to deny that it's sending weapons or technologies or whatever to Russia, but I think that plays well to their internal audience. It doesn't play well to the learned folks outside of their internal audience. And I think that China is an extremely shrewd partner of Russia and Mr. Putin. I think that China is masterful at getting what they need from Mr. Putin. And I wouldn't go as far as some pundits or some people who write and say that, Russia has become the little brother in this arrangement. I don't know that that's appropriate, but what is clear is China is not there just out of the goodwill of their thoughts. They have expectations. They are maneuvering Russia to accomplish things that they want to accomplish and to sort of restrict Russia in some cases. I point back to during my time as the SACEUR when Russia invaded Crimea and then Russia invaded the Donbass. I think that they were surprised by world reaction. And if you remember, they reached out to China to establish this picture of cooperation, and they gave China this huge oil deal, which really the pipeline was only completed a couple of years ago and started flowing this oil. And China abused Russia in that oil deal. And Russia is losing money every day on that oil deal. And I think this is kind of the picture of what China is doing. They see Russia as a very needy country right now. They need friends, big friends. They need trading partners, etc., etc. And Russia is a pretty pliable cooperating party for the Chinese, and I think the Chinese are masterfully maneuvering in order to take advantage when they can.
So, what should the West's response be? I mean, other than upping the rhetoric and calling out China more publicly, as the NATO leaders did last week, you could talk about sanctions. There are already sanctions in place. You could have more, but are they really going to make an impact? Is there anything the West could do to try and peel away Xi Jinping from Vladimir Putin?
So, sanctions in China are a slippery slope. As you know, much like a lot of Western Europe, and still are, but a lot more of them were almost completely dependent on Russian oil. You have to be careful not to bite too hard the hand that feeds. If you are dependent on Russian energy, it becomes a little hard to impact them. The United States, certainly, and to a degree also Europe, is dependent on Chinese trade, Chinese investment, Chinese this, that, and the other. And so the West has to be careful, because when you make yourself dependent on someone, they have the ability to affect your future. And right now, many of the tools we might want to use against China are not helpful because we are so dependent on them in many ways. And so while we can take certain actions and we can do certain sanctions or trade restrictions or whatever to bring pressure on China, the most important thing to do is become less dependent on China. Okay? Just like some Americans tried to lecture Western Europe about oil dependency on Russia, we need to look in the mirror and lecture ourselves on being dependent on China. We need to get back in the business of doing things that we are dependent on China. And I've seen the numbers all over the place, but a very high percentage, over 90% or high 80% of the rights to the world's rare earths are held by China. We need to make ourselves less dependent on those rare earths, and we need to find our own sources of those rare earths, because China has a huge fulcrum of leverage to maneuver the West if the West gets too boisterous in their dealing with China. So I didn't give you any answers. I think we can use the tools of sanctions and things around the margin, but I don't think that we're going to find our way to anything that is demonstrative, because we are dependent on China. We have put ourselves in this bad situation.
And just finally, General, zooming out a bit and looking at where the lay of the land is in regards to the war in Ukraine in July 2024, as someone who obviously wants to see Ukraine win, how are you feeling about their prospects currently? It's been a difficult start of the year with the Russian offensive and with delays in Western military aid. How are you feeling currently? How do you see the state of play?
Well, let me point the finger right straight at us. The fact that we gapped their supply in a political struggle inside my country is embarrassing. It is embarrassing. And we need to sort ourselves in order to not see that ever happen again, because our political embarrassment resulted in the death of Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian men, women, and children, and the loss of Ukrainian land. Let me just say that one more time so we can understand sort of the personal pronouns involved here. Our mismanagement resulted in the loss of Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian civilians, men, women, and children, and Ukrainian land. That's a really sad state of affairs. And so what we see in general, excuse me, when we equip Ukraine correctly, they win. How this war ends is 100% a matter of Western policy. If we choose to give Ukraine what they need to win, they will win. We are not giving them what they need to win because we are deterred. Mr. Putin's most effective weapon is his war of intimidation, his war of words. He has convinced most of the current set of Western leadership that his nearly weekly reference to something nuclear and his constant references to widening the war, etc., 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 these all have deterred decision makers of the West. And we desperately need to rethink policy and move forward. Again, Ukraine's not asking for our people. They're asking for our support. I would ask you as a journalist to go look at the cost of World War I or World War II on a daily basis, rationalized forward to today's dollars. Look at what a couple of days in the war cost during battles. Battle of the Bulge, D-Day, and you name it. There's a whole bunch of times. Compare the cost of a day of fighting that war to what the West has done for Ukraine so far. We do not want to pay the cost of another war. What we're investing now is well below the costs of wars. And so I think we need to be really thinking when we decide not to support Ukraine.
And what you're describing, it sounds like total indoctrination. What do you think the objective is? What does the Russian Federation want to get out of this?
First of all, the most important thing to understand about Russia is that every single human being under Russian control is an asset to achieve the more strategic goals of the Russian authorities. And in the context of the both kidnapping Ukrainian children and indoctrinating the children who are staying in their homes is, first of all, as I mentioned before, is making the local residents to cooperate with the authorities, because we have heard numerous examples that people often say that in every it doesn't matter whether it's a rather big city or like tiny village. It's enough to have even the tiniest rumors that your neighbors or someone's relative's child was kidnapped by Russian authorities. It's already enough to spread terror in this area and make people more coercive to Russian authorities. Also, on the other hand, we have already recorded and open criminal cases, by the way, about that Russian authorities are making underage to join Russian military already. Even we have those instances from occupied areas from Donetsk, Lugansk region, Crimea, much less from the so-called newly occupied territories. But we have already evidence about that children are being used as soldiers for Russian army. And also, we should remember that the war is already taking 10 years. And the 10 years means that one generation of children has already been through the full educational cycle of secondary education. That means that there is an entire generation of children who has been through the entire process of indoctrination and militarization through the Russian system of secondary education. And that is why many of those children who are already adults, who are already about 18, 19, 20 years old, they are also joining Russian army and fighting in this war as well. And this is one of the one of the future goals for the Russian authorities as well. And also the deporting of Ukrainian children is one of the means of passportization of the local residents, because many people are trying to avoid being granted the Russian passport. And for example, if child doesn't attend local school, because for many parents don't want their children to be exposed to this indoctrination, and those children are being tracked down by local authorities, and after the local occupational authorities realize that this child does not attend local school, the parents of this child are being threatened to lose their custody on their own child. And after knowing that this is like horrifying by itself, but knowing the fact that child can be taken away not only from like your home, from your care, but also taken away like even thousands of kilometers away, because we know the instances that the children who were kidnapped, they were even taken as far as, maybe you have checked where the last prison of late Alexei Navalny was, in Yamal-Nenetsky district, like extremely far in deep Russia.
Now, I was going to say, thankfully that there have been some cases of children being returned to Ukraine, but when you listen to the way you describe what is going on in terms of the temporarily occupied territories, but also what's been happening with the children being forcibly removed from Ukraine, I mean, just specifically at those temporarily occupied territories, it seems like it's going to take generations for them to recover. I mean, what kind of future can you envisage for them?
Yes, definitely, it's extremely traumatic experience, and that is why like those damage which is being done for entire generation is also like, to my personal opinion, is one of the strategic goals of the of Russian authorities, because like in the modern war, in the war which they are conducting right now, this is not necessary to kill people in millions to erase the entire nation, because all these efforts like this, like physical killing, torturing, terrorizing, kidnapping children, indoctrination through education, indoctrination of adults as well, kidnapping adults as well, is one big strategic picture of erasing the Ukrainian identity in general, because everything which is being done on temporarily occupied territories, which is about 20% of the Ukrainian lands, is making people terrified of this part of their identity. Also, like having this inner fear to practice the parts of their identity, like speaking the language solely. And that is why, like, we see that the children who are luckily being returned to Ukraine, they suffer very difficult consequences of being exposed to efforts like this. This is extremely traumatic for them, and that's why they are going through the long-term rehabilitation process. And for us, for Ukraine, it means also a huge challenge to come up with a policy how to rehabilitate the people who, when we talk about the thousands of people, when we liberate those territories.
And have you been able to get a sense of if it's working, how well it's working in those temporarily occupied territories to achieve those strategic objectives of erasing Ukrainian identity? Do you think it's being successful?
Frankly speaking, I definitely have no means to check any hypothesis I have, because right in the moment, no Ukrainian institution, no Ukrainian organization has access to temporarily occupied territories, and international organizations are not allowed to enter those territories as well. So basically, if it's not being reported by Russian Russian authorities or Russian media, if it's, for example, any foreign reporter, etc., it's also not such a trustworthy information, because they allow to get to those territories only those actors who are loyal or sympathetic to Russian state. But we definitely see the intent behind at this point we can speak about genocidal intent behind Russian actions. And from the scale which we can define from the open source, and frankly speaking, the scale we are being able to see right now, it's only the minimum amount. That is why I believe the consequences will be tremendous. And that is why, like, many people, I know for sure, I know for the fact that there are so many people who are waiting for the return of Ukraine to those territories, who are staying patriotic to Ukrainian state, but from different because of the different reasons they have to stay on those territories. Like, for some people, it's important to stay where they grow up, or, for example, someone cannot leave their elder parents or grandparents, etc. There are so many reasons why people stay. But for those people, it's extremely painful and scary to stay there for such a long time, because, like, every single day you're being exposed to the threat of being tortured, of being killed, and you have to be extremely careful of even about your digital behavior, for example, of even to get information about what is going on in Ukraine, or basically get any piece of news, for example, which was not censored by the Russian propagandistic machine, is quite a struggle for those people and quite a risk.
And just finally, Anastasiia, in your research, in trying to actually look at the scale of this non-violent pursuance of genocidal intent that you mentioned, what is the thing that stays with you the most? What's the thing that's left the biggest impression on you?
Frankly speaking, for me personally, the most painful thing about that they are targeting even the youngest ones, because the programs of the so-called patriotic education begin as early as kindergarten. And even in instances of on the first side, neutral events, neutral interactions with children, for example, like the celebration of New Year, Russian authorities are still managing to turn every single event, every single interaction to the propagandistic event, or, for example, the case to make children and their families exposed to the contact with the Russian authorities or Russian military. And, for example, the organization for the youngest is called like Baby Eagles, Orlята in Russian. And this is targeted for the children as young as like 5 years old. And for me, it's the most horrifying which you can do is targeting the most vulnerable ones.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.